It was the Great Blizzard of 1888 where New York City saw almost 5 feet of snow. And that blizzard actually went from Maine all the way down to Maryland. And that event inspired the construction of an underground transit system in New York. In the 1800s, you had many elevated lines, independently owned elevated lines, which dominated New York City's rapid transit system. And it wasn't until 1904 where the first underground subway opened on 27 October in Lower Manhattan's City Hall. That stop is historic and you can still see it. It has vaulted ceilings. It was beautifully made. So this day, if you're taking the 6 train to the last stop and you remain on the train and it loops back around to go back uptown, and you can see the station. By the 1910s, most of those independent lines have been consolidated into 2 primary lines, the IRT and the BMT. In 1965, Governor Norman Rockefeller created the MCTA, the Metropolitan Commuter Transit Authority, and its function was to purchase, upgrade, and maintain the LIRR, the Long Island Railroad, and it would later become the MTA. Today it's the MTA. In the 70s and 80s, graffiti and crime were everywhere. And in the 80s, Mayor Koch instituted what graffiti writers call the buff, which is when all the trains were either painted over or just cleaned, and they had these new cars, which they had this new process where they cleaned the trains and they wouldn't let one train out if it had graffiti on it. Speaking of the NYC subway, one of my favorite books of all time is a book called The Mole People by Jennifer Toth. And not necessarily so much now, but especially back in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s, there was the shelter system was hell for the homeless. It was pretty much even worse than being on Rikers Island, worse than being incarcerated. You could get raped, robbed, a number of things could happen to you. So a lot of people would just wing it and take their chances on the street. So you got to remember, New York City goes down in some areas, descends almost 7 stories underground, like beneath Grand Central Station, the area I'm telling you near Riverside Park. But within that a labyrinth of tunnels and levels of tunnels, you have abandoned train stations, you have defunct work areas where workers who would work on the track would have their lunch and store their supplies. You have tunnels which are no longer in use. So you have small pockets of homeless people who created actual communities in these areas underground. They would even cook down there. And you'd be surprised, they would decorate these bunkers like apartments. Fascinating, but great read, check it out. And some other fun facts about the New York City subway: there are 472 stations, and the only train line which does not pass through Manhattan is the G train. In 2001, the Cortlandt Street station on the 1 line partially collapsed when the towers went down, and that didn't reopen to 17 years later. There have been stations added like Hudson Yards on the 7 line and the Q train, and that's actually been in talks. They've been trying to do that since the early 20th century, but the project kept getting scrapped or being put on hold or lost funding. The second half of the project is actually going to be the T train, and that's going to go all the way down, up and down 2nd Avenue from the South Street Seaport up to 125th Street in East Harlem.